Hello, hello, beautiful women. Welcome. Welcome to this sacred Sunday session. I wonder, have you had a chance to create a bit of time for yourself today? I wonder if it's something that you have found with ease or whether you've had to kind of push yourself to show up for yourself today. I am excited to be able to be joining you, to be sharing this conversation and opening up to the wonderful possibilities that exist in our Sacred Sunday sessions together. Today, I really wanted to explore the nature. We talk a lot about coming home to your center. This journey home to sacred self is about centering and moving from a place of center through life. And I thought it would be really interesting to open up the conversation around, if you're not in your center, where are you? Because for the majority of us, these moments of kind of touching into center are fleeting. They're kind of these glimpses. We have moments where we are fully aware and we're using practices to take ourselves into our center. Moments like this where we are conversing and expanding our awareness of what's possible. But generally, we also have these moments where we kind of touch in on center and it's an unconscious thing. We kind of realize when we're there, here we are. I've just had this special moment and I was totally here and present for it. So the process of being in center is something that can come from so many different angles in our life. What we generally will find is that the majority of our time is we're not in our center. So what does that mean? What does that feel like? That's really what I want to explore with you today. So hopefully you can join me, if not here in this live sharing, then later down the line when you have got that bit of precious time with yourself. And just opening up to the possibilities of how and where are we in our being. And some of us may have a tendency when we start to open up to this exploration, we notice our tendency, we may notice where we're hanging out more often than not. And so I think it'd be good to start with a bit of an analogy or a metaphor, something that kind of gives an idea of where I'm going with this. So I spent years exploring the kind of concept that my life, I was constantly on a seesaw. You know those playground things that you get on and one person on each end and the seesaw goes up and down and the weight of the other person helps to keep that momentum going. That's kind of the visual that I had for life. And I felt like for so many years I was really present and aware of where I was on this spectrum of this tilting, moving scale. And there would be moments where I was in my center, and I don't know if you've been on a seesaw, but if you sit in the center of it, it doesn't move, it doesn't go anywhere. But if you take even the slightest step to one side, the whole thing starts to tilt. If you take a step to the other side, the whole seesaw tilts the other way. So one end drops and the other end comes up. The beauty of this analogy is that we're looking and we're talking about a spectrum where there is a range of energies, emotions, experiences that are happening, and any one thing can be tilting the scale, tilting this kind of scale that we're standing on, moving on, experiencing life on. So for years I felt very, very consciously aware of being on this constant tilting scale. And for the majority of the time I kept catching myself as I would lose momentum, or I would shift my weight in one direction and I would spiral off the edge. There was a very fine line between being in my center and tipping off the tipping point, being at the extreme end of that spectrum. And so that kind of imagery, that idea might help to create a kind of tangible way for you to link into where I'm going with this exploration today, because I really want to explore not only what it means to be in center, but I want to explore the spectrum. I want to explore the extreme ends of this spectrum that we are constantly dancing on. We are constantly tipping one way or the other. And for the most part, as I say, this journey of coming home to center is to find our way back to that neutral place where we're not as easily tipped off balance, where we are a little more grounded and solid in our experience of ourselves and of life and the relationships we have in life. So I recently did a beautiful open floor workshop. It's actually a series that I'm doing, and this practice, this kind of exploration that I have been on for years, was named so beautifully in one of the exercises that we did. And so it was really looking at this spectrum that I'm talking about, this seesaw that we're constantly on, as being there is this center point. And in the open floor practice, they referred to that as being like a window of presence. So I really resonated with the words that they used to describe this spectrum, and I'm going to use them here, but I encourage you to kind of find your own, because for me, as I said, it's always just been a seesaw, and I've been moving between overstimulation and understimulation and somewhere in between. In this open floor exploration, we looked at being in our center as being in a window of presence, and it's really naming the experience of being in your center as being fully present, as fully present to the moment as we can be. And what is that experience when we are there? How does that affect us? What does that feel like? And you may like to share, if you're here in the replay, share in the comments, when you are in your center, what is that experience like? How do you know you're in your center? And for myself, I know that when I'm in my center, there is a sense of groundedness, a solidness in my being. It's like my connection is anchored in such a way where if something wild or crazy was about to happen, it wouldn't completely push me over. I would still have my footing. I'd be solid in my feet. I'd be solid in my connection with the earth. And solid in myself. It's almost like, holding onto a pole, holding onto the center pole of a ship through a big storm. Having that sensation of all the elements and environment around changing and moving, but knowing that at any point in time I've got hold of that center pole and nothing can kind of knock me off that center. That's kind of on more of a metaphoric level, but on a physical level, when I'm in my place of center, I have an effortless kind of fluid flow of breath, rhythmic flow of breath. And my heart rate kind of feels steady. It feels like it has the ability to meet whatever I'm doing. And as well as kind of feeling centered and grounded and present to my physical body, I'm also very aware that my emotions are kind of in tune with that same sense of rhythm. It's like they're within a container that is not only manageable but proportional to the experience that I'm having. What else is there? On a spiritual level, when I'm in my center, I feel like I'm connected to something much bigger, something far greater than me. And that connection is enriched, it's infused by a life force that is fluid and moving. So I'm almost receptive to it. I can bend and move with grace. I can kind of meet the challenges that are coming with more ease. And that is part of having a deeper connection to spirit, to soul, to the life force that is flowing within me. So if you have a moment, share your comments. I'd love to know, what is that experience like for you, if you've experienced it, being in your center, on a physical level, emotional level, on a mental level. How does that feel? I know for myself, mentally, when I'm centered, it's like there is more space. There's more space between the thoughts. There's more clarity. There's probably a less, rather than focusing on the negative, let's focus on the positive. in that positive state of mind, I am positive. I've got more of an experience of life that is filled with gratitude and appreciation. And so the state of mind is also a reflection of that spaciousness that's happening in the body, that sense of grounding that's happening in the body, that easefulness and flow. All of that is kind of rippled physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually when I'm in that state of center. And the shift can happen so subtly. The shift of moving off center or being tipped off center, it can happen in the blink of an eye. Now, it could be that my environment invokes it. It could be something that happens outside of me. It could be that somebody comes into my space. Have you ever had that experience where you've been in a room on your own, or you've just been in the zone doing your own thing, and then all of a sudden someone walks in the room and they're like, whoo, whether they're angry or excited, it doesn't kind of matter what their emotion is. It's like, it's full, and it comes into your space, and it can knock you. It can kind of be like, whoa. Now, generally, the more we practice being in our center, the harder it is for us to kind of be knocked off balance by these kind of external energies coming into play. But the reality is we are totally human, amazing beings that are empathic, we are responsive, we are totally interwoven with our environment. So naturally, something changes in our environment. That change can be enough to just tip us off balance. Generally speaking, and this is now I'm going to open up and expand into this spectrum that I'm referring to, there are kind of two directions that we can go. This is the seesaw now. The first is into a state of stimulus. It's like, okay, it's a really simple but out of this world experience. You're walking through the forest, it's a lovely day, you're beautiful, you're centered, you're calm, you're in your lovely place enjoying the sun and the light and the feeling of the earth underneath you and the sounds of the birds, and everything's kind of grounding and bringing you into that place of bliss within. And then boom, a tiger jumps out of the forest and you're like, your whole being becomes overstimulated. We go into what is known as fight or flight response. This state of high arousal is one extreme end of the spectrum. And most of you will know what it feels like when you tip into this end of the spectrum. If you've got a minute now, feel into it. You're walking through the forest, you're having that blissful moment, and bam, something jumps out and scares the hell out of you. Bring that experience into your mind, bring that up and let that become a rich experience, and notice how your body responds. I can feel it, and you may even be able to hear it. My voice is faster, my energy is higher. You'll see I've even kind of lifted up in my shoulders and my chest. My breathing's become a little more shallow. It's up here in my chest. Let yourself be infused with this kind of possibility, and share in the comments what comes up for you. What are the physical things you notice? What are the mental things you notice? The emotional? What happens when your state of being shifts from being in that place of center and jumps up into a state of a hyper arousal, high arousal? And then noticing that is a key part of this whole journey of awareness, because the more we become aware of where we are in the spectrum, the easier it is to be able to guide ourselves back to center. So first and foremost, what are the triggers? What are those physical triggers, the emotional, mental triggers that you can notice in yourself when you shift from being in your center to being hyper aroused? So I shared a couple of mine, as I said. Shallow breathing, everything kind of lifted, my energy lifted, my shoulders lifted to my ears. My breath quickened, my heart rate quickened, my voice changed, I started talking faster. There was a sense of edginess. And I'm slowly coming back down. I'm bringing myself back down into my center now. So those signs are starting to kind of fall away a little bit. But this is one end of the spectrum. And the beautiful thing is, and what we've just done with this little practice, is realize that yes, We can be triggered by our external environment. We can be triggered by a circumstance, by people around us, by animals around us, by pretty much anything outside of us can be a trigger into this state of hyper arousal. But we can trigger that hyper arousal just by having a thought. So just now we did this little practice in our mind where we imagined ourselves walking through a forest and a tiger jumped out at us. By allowing ourselves to really go there, to go into the mind, to really follow the story, to be a character, be fully in our story, we can trigger this hyper alertness in ourselves, this hyper arousal. And so it doesn't even have to be an external thing. We could be sitting in a room in a completely safe environment, and all we have to do is start to think about something that freaks us out, that makes us feel nervous, that worries us, that's something about the future, or we go back into a story of our past where we didn't like the outcome, we didn't like the situation. We can revisit traumas of the past. All of these things, and boom, notice the sensation, notice what's there. The same physical, mental, emotional signs that you would have if a tiger jumped out at you. So our bodies can't differentiate that, the difference between memory and real life experience on a subconscious level. They're all programmed with the same kind of auto response that happens from the body. So just our thoughts are enough to send us up into this hyper arousal, high arousal area. So when we start to think about that, think about the qualities of high arousal for our bodies, for our beings. There is these physical signs, as I say, shortness of breath, fast beating heart, possible clammy, sweaty hands, tension, tightness, everything being held up high. An over-energizing of the body, over-stimulation of the nervous system. Then we've got the emotions. It's like there can be this wave of fear, anxiety, uncertainty, confusion. Everything's kind of too much, overwhelming. We have mental state, overstimulation. Our mind goes a million miles an hour and can't really find creative solutions. Everything's kind of out there and rapid fire. So this fight-flight response is a natural thing, and it serves us, It has really rich energy to it. It helps us to get things done when we're harnessing it in a positive way. But we're talking that far, far end of the spectrum where we're tipping off the edge. Now, talk to this idea about being on the seesaw and how I feel like I spent so many years of my life falling off one end and then falling off the other, trying to find somewhere in the middle. And the middle was really, really hard for me to find. I didn't have an anchor to being in my center at that point in time. I was either falling off this end or falling off the other. So for me, I spent a long, long time tipping off that end of high arousal, where I lived in a manic state. My being was in this constant, perpetual state of doing, rushing from one thing to the next thing, and I wasn't even really in my body. It was kind of like head up, disembodied from the neck down. And I think this is generally a common experience for a lot of women, especially women who are living multi-rolled lives, running businesses, having families, children, husbands, partners, all these things that are part of needing to be outside of ourselves, constantly serving the outer world, can be high arousal end of the spectrum. And when we start to really lean into the awareness of when we are in that state, we start to notice all the things that kind of cause disharmony in our lives, the things that cause us to become ill in our physical bodies, to become ill in our minds, and to become emotionally burnt out. So everything on this end of the spectrum is out of proportion. Our emotions, our thoughts, our mental stamina, our spiritual connection is lacking. We're not able to connect into spirit. We're not in our bodies. We're up in our headspace. So when we're in that far end of the spectrum, we reach burnout. We reach burnout a lot in our lives. And generally as women, to hang out in that area is, we need to lean into resources of energy that we actually don't have. We're going outside of ourselves again. So adrenal glands burn out. We're constantly running on adrenaline, which causes problems for us long term, further down the line. Our adrenals are so intrinsically linked with our hormonal system, so our endocrine system. So when we burn out our adrenals over and over again, we may start to experience more problems with our hormones and the regularity of our cycles. And these are the things that really help us to come home to our center. So the further down that line we go, the more stimulated we are, the more hyper aroused we are, the more we start to see chronic illness in our bodies and in our experience of life. The other end of the spectrum, so we've gone into hyperarousal, the tiger's jumped out of us, and we have totally fight or flight response mode. The other end of the spectrum is, the other end. Most people commonly know this: fight, flight, or freeze. So we're moving now to the other end of the spectrum, where you're walking through the forest and a tiger jumps out at you and you're like, yeah, whatever. This is low arousal. This is the end of the spectrum that we go into when we are numb, we are disassociated, we're not even really here. We're moving through the paces, we're having this experience of life, but we're not actually experiencing anything. We've kind of closed off the gates. This kind of bounce between either end of the spectrum can be really, really challenging, and it can be the nature of our journey as women, is to flick between the two. I know for myself, my 20s were totally high arousal, low plummeting, flopping, falling off the other end. So it'd be like I'd spend this period of time in just like go, 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 brrr, and then all of a sudden it would be like eventually too much on the entire system, and it would literally just shut down and I would shut down. Boom. And so this kind of midsection, the center, didn't exist. I was either falling off one end of the seesaw in hyper over arousal, or I'd be just boom, cactus. I would be flopped on the couch. I couldn't move. I couldn't converse. Other people basically didn't exist. I couldn't. It was too much to even consider spending time with other people. I became numb to myself, numb to my thoughts, numb to my body, disassociated, disconnected from spirit, disconnected from my own inner longings and what it was I even wanted or needed. These are just my experiences. Again, you will have your own, so allow yourself to explore it and maybe share something in the comments. Where do you go when you tip into low arousal end of the spectrum? And low arousal is exactly what that says. Low arousal. You are not aroused by anything in life anymore. It's the libido goes bleh, out the door. The excitement, the passion, the vitality, it's gone. So feeling into what your experience is of these two spectrums. The high, hyper, fight or flight end of the spectrum, and then this low arousal, depression, heaviness, moodiness, whatever kind of stimulation comes up there for you. If you've had that experience, you'll know it and you'll be able to name some of those qualities. As I said, share some in the comments. I love the idea that we can lean into each other's wisdom here, because some of us may not have had experiences on both ends of the spectrum. And it does help to really get a gauge. And often we may not actually associate that particular experience as being low arousal. But then when someone else names it, you're like, oh, yeah, actually, yeah, I've had that. And it was totally on that end of the spectrum for me. So share some thoughts. Share what you notice in yourself when you are dropping into a low arousal state. The emotional kind of heaviness, sorrow, grief, just flat, and a tendency to want to escape, avoid life and situations, to get caught up in fantasy, whether it's fantasy of the mind, stories of the past or the future, or made up situations that we kind of play out in our minds, or whether it's actual fantasy like escaping into a movie, a television, or anything where we can be in complete avoidance of life and the feelings that we're having. And this also kind of then moves into that spectrum of, well, both ends of the spectrum have the capacity for us to be able to move into like recreational drugs and and eating and all of these kind of habits that start to form when we hang out in either end of the spectrum for a long period of time, because they're kind of they're self-medicating ways that we manage the experience. So if we're in hyper arousal all the time, we may be looking for the things that help to bring us down, slow us down. And if we're in the constant state of low arousal, then we tend to find things that continue to numb us to that state. Drugs, alcohol, cigarettes even, all of those things, but also generally tend to lift us up a little and give us a little bit more energy, artificial energy. So these are the two ends of the spectrum that we are constantly dancing in between, and this is what the center is. The center is that place in the middle where when we're there, we're kind of in harmony. But all it takes, as I say, is like barely even a shift of weight from one side to the other, and we can begin to find imbalance happening in our lives. What I want to talk to here, so this is kind of now you're getting a fuller range of the spectrum. You can start to see both the positives and negatives in each. Every one of these areas on the spectrum have something to offer us. They can be rich life experiences, or they can be things that create more challenges and more general imbalance in our lives. So once you start to really feel into where are you hanging out in your life, what's your tendency, where's your go-to? I know for myself, my go-to has been hyper arousal and overexcitement and general burnout. But I've totally experienced the other end of the spectrum a lot. In fact, actually, I can give you an example here. I spent a good period of my life, I had quite a traumatic incident happen to me in my mid-20s, and there was a period of time, nearly 18 months, that I functioned on adrenal energy. So I actually, my food and that wasn't a source of energy for me in that time. My body purely ran off adrenaline, and that kept me in for nearly 18 months, a hyper alert state that caused quite a lot of issues for my body. But what I didn't realize at the time, and it came later down the line, hence my understanding a little more of the endocrine system, was that a number of years later, I started to experience some pretty full-on thyroid issues. And they were a direct correlation to this period of time in my life where I burnt my adrenals out. So the reality for me was that I had this abrupt health concern that came up for me that was basically telling me that if I did not slow down and find center, there was a good chance I was going to have a heart attack in like my 20s. So I mean, what a crazy reality to face. This life-threatening situation caused by hanging out in my hyper-arousal end of the spectrum way too much. So life has a really funny way of guiding us to where we need to be, but it often comes after a lot of signs along the way. So I had more signs than I could have counted that were urging me to slow down, urging me to come back to my center, that I completely and totally ignored. And that's okay. That's okay. Let's name that it's okay, because I think it's really, really easy in these situations to become critical of ourselves. And I don't want that for you or for me. I want us to be able to explore our nature and explore our tendencies in a way where we can become aware of the pattern, in a way where we can become aware of where do we go? Where's our comfort place? Because your comfort place can be on one end of an extreme spectrum. It doesn't have to be comfortable in the middle. It can be comfortable anywhere, because we become patterned by it. We become programmed by that. So when you are in hyper arousal all of the time, anything less than that can be a bit of a plateau. It can be kind of boring. So just noticing where we hang out is a key part of our journey in being able to start to reprogram, to set some new patterns, and to notice how, when we slip into autopilot, where we're going to take ourselves. The reason I'm saying this is because it took me years of journeying with this awareness before I really started to hone my center, hone it to a point where I knew where it was, I knew what it felt like, I knew how to get there, and most importantly, I started to catch myself as I was starting to tip one way or the other. So for a good while, it was in hindsight. Like I would be, yep, I'm in my center, boom, fall off an edge and be like, oh, yep, that was the edge. Took it too far. Should have listened to all of those intuitive, signposts along the way. And every time I got a little bit closer to catching myself before I tipped off the edge, until eventually I started to catch myself in those early stages of losing balance. And I didn't fall off the edge completely. I didn't get to that point of burnout where, holy crap, I can't move and life has to stop because I cannot deal with life right now. It was like the more I journeyed with awareness, the more that spectrum went from being extreme ends of the spectrum to more manageable, proportional experiences of those extremes. So still having a level of hyperarousal, but not staying in that level of hyperarousal. Following the signposts along the way and allowing myself to come back. Journeying down that path of lazy, lethargic, don't care, numb, don't want to involve myself in the world, and knowing when to pull myself back from that, knowing where the edge was before falling off it and spiraling downward into a big heap. So this is the journey. The journey is a journey of awareness. And there's no right or wrong. There is no fixing it or making it better. There is simply noticing and observing your patterns, noticing how you are dealing with life and what your tendency or your autopilot programming is set to. So one of the key things that's really rich here, and this is where I say there is no right or wrong, there is no good or bad in this spectrum, because the whole spectrum has something to offer us. When we are in hyper arousal, we get things done. If you want to hang out in this beautiful place of presence and mindfulness and being here and being now, it's bliss. But it's also in the back body, it's also very, it can be very complacent. You can slip into a place of contentment where you don't actually strive for anything new. So as rich and as wonderful as this place of center is, as this kind of, you're holding on to this wonderful post, it can be detrimental if all you do is try and hold on to that post and not move. Because that's the emphasis of a comfort zone. A comfort zone is this little box that you create where it's familiar, you know what to expect, and you don't move from within it. We don't grow in our comfort zone. We can rest, we can replenish, and for periods of our life, we need to be in that comfort zone in order to do those things. I spent 2 years with this thyroid journey. It took me 2 years of shutting down and being in my comfort zone, coming to know what my center was, how to be there, how to nurture that connection, how to live from that. And in order for me to really go there and allow myself to go there, I actually had to shut down external world. Like I couldn't be around other people. I couldn't watch television. All these things were too overstimulating for me. So sometimes in our lives, that comfort zone is necessary in order for us to know ourselves, to come home to ourselves, and to not, and to reprogram, to reset the program, that otherwise the distractions instantly take us back. We're replaying our pattern over and over. So honoring the importance of comfort zone, honoring the importance of knowing when to be there for deep healing purposes. But then really honoring and naming the importance of having both ends of this spectrum where if we push ourselves just out to the edges of this window of presence, this place of center, if we push ourselves, where is our edge of our center? And this is a beautiful inquiry, because once you start to know your center, once you start to feel it and be able to come home to it with more and more ease, the next step is meeting your edge. Where is the edge of that center? At what point am I in my center and then I'm not? What point am I excited and pumped up and motivated and feeling my energy rise on that edge of arousal? And then what point do I tip over that into over arousal? And you will have heard that, seen that, felt that in what I was just sharing there. There's a difference. I can meet my edge. I can go right to it. I can get myself excited. I can get myself motivated. I can really lift my energy levels there. But notice that I'm not where I was before when I was talking about that hyper arousal level where it's, yes, okay, I'm there and I'm happening and it's up, 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 up. So where's the edge? This is the exploration. So we know our center, we come to know our center, and through these kind of practices and explorations, we really start to ground in our center, so it gets easier for us to be there. Then we start to explore the edge. Now this edge, this beautiful edge of our comfort zone is our growth zone. So this is where we are able to stand holding that center post on the boat and ride some pretty epic waves, some pretty wild storms, and do so but in that place of center. So how do we do that? How do we nurture that? This is where we want to be hanging out for the majority of the time if we can, because we're growing, we're expanding, we're moving beyond the limitations of who we think we are, we're moving into something more. But we're doing that from a place of center. And epic growth happens here in this place. It's like that. It's such a perpetual state of growth when we learn to find that edge and be able to harness it as a source in our life, because it gets momentum. It's like one thought leads into brrr, and next thing you know, life has just completely turned on its head and you have a whole new life experience happening. So there is power in these peripheral edges of the center and our extreme polar ends of hyper arousal and low arousal. So again, that importance of being able to know the edge of our low arousal. Where is the edge that I can go to? How far can I go into that place of deep rest and softening and lethargy in my body that can be from my place of center? And at what point does that tip and start to spiral downward into depression or into a numbness or a disconnection from life, you know? How do I harness the energy of that? Because I need the full spectrum. We need the full spectrum in order to get the richest experience out of life. And it's fun to play with. It's really fun to play with. This exploration is fun. I mean, that may be hard to hear, especially if you're hanging out in either end of the extreme, because I know those places and it's like, really, dude, this is not fun. This is not fun at all. This is freaking horrible. I'm burning out and I can't keep up with life, or I just don't care and I can't seem to get myself out of this goddamn hole. Those spectrums are really challenging places to be, but they're rich places to be when you become aware of them. Because when you're aware, you have the capacity to start to change. The first part of any stage of inner transformation is identifying. And so that's what these practices are. That's what this conversation is. It's about identifying where you are on the spectrum, where you hang out, what your autopilot is. Identifying whether you have the resources right now. And you may not have the resources to be able to bring yourself to center right now. And that's okay too. Honoring that that's where you are in your journey, because you're here and you're showing up to this space where we are exploring more resources, we're sharing resources together. So you're already tapping into what you know you need on a soul level to be able to find more balance and harmony in your life. And it's totally okay if you're not there yet, you know. So really honoring where we are in the spectrum and how we move, how we dance. And when I think of the word grace, when I talk about moving graciously with life, this is this is my image. I have this image of me standing on a seesaw in the center with a foot on kind of either side, and I'm just got this little bounce going where I can be aroused, I can be totally into a lazy Netflix day. I could be where I need to be, but I can be doing that in the best part from my place of center, from my place of deep presence and awareness of where I am. And then there's still those moments where I fall off the edge and go, oh gosh, oh, you're never going to learn it, are you? You know, this is life. This is the human experience, and we're meant to have the full richness of this experience in this spectrum. But why I talk today about all of this beautiful relationship to this moving, fluid spectrum that we are on is because the journey to center, it starts with this level of awareness. How do you know when you're in your center? Usually it's because you know you're not in your center. So being able to identify what signs are there for you. How do you know when you're not in your center? And together, through these beautiful sacred Sundays and through the conversations that we're going to have in this space, we're going to be in a place where we can start to really not only acknowledge when we're not in our center, but we're going to be able to start finding practices that bring us into our center. So I would love to know your thoughts on all of this, because as I said, we all have very different experiences of this spectrum, and we have a lot we can learn from each other when it comes to how we navigate these extreme polar ends, and how and what it is we notice in our tendencies of life to respond to external stimulant and to our own thought processes, because as I said, our thoughts and our memories have just as much capacity to tip us off either end of the spectrum as our external world does. So just noticing and using this conversation as an invitation for you to start to notice what's there, what insight is there for you. And to finish, I'd like to share, now this is a really simple little mantra. It's a Sufi mantra shared with me by one of my teachers. And all it is, I mean, with any mantra, really, you're just kind of repeating a sound or a statement or a word. But in the Sufism practice, these particular words, it's ka, he, are the words. They are referring to being deeply centered, grounded, and at the same time connected to a higher state of consciousness. So this, to me, the words ka, he, they bring to mind that image of holding the mast, holding that center post on a boat. And there are days where I'm holding it and the sun's shining and it's beautiful, and there's days where I'm holding it and I'm riding the wildest storm on the ocean you could ever imagine. But I'm holding it. Ka, he, ka, he. This center pole, ka, he, is the center pole. So it's a really simple mantra, and it's one you can do anytime. You can mumble it under your breath, but that practice of ka, he, ka, he, letting the he be a he, kind of exhale, but dropping down into whatever place that lands for you. For me, it's kind of pelvis, center, and down into my feet. Ka, he, ka, he, ka, he, ka, he, ka, he, ka, he. Join me, do it a couple of times, see if it resonates. It may or may not, but feel into not just the sounds, but feel into the state of presence that you are holding your center pole. Ka, he, ka, he, ka, he. And one of the things that this particular practice is used for is really, it's about knowing how to stand in our center through the wild transformational fires of life. So that idea that we are constantly being urged to grow and expand and to move beyond what we know of ourselves, and that is a wild ride, and it's turbulent. We need turbulence in order for us to be stirred up, for things to stir up and then resettle again. So ka, huh, is that center pole that we can ride the wild turbulence that is happening in our lives, that is happening within us, holding that center pole. So explore that little practice. And again, as I say, I love to know your thoughts on this conversation and any insights that you might have had. And I'm looking forward to diving deeper with you in our next Sacred Sunday practice. But perhaps between now and then, could you maybe set, not that I like the idea of homework per se, but I love the idea of kind of a conscious thread. So I'd like to weave a conscious thread between now and next Sacred Sunday and invite you to start to really notice the physical, emotional, mental signs of where you are on this spectrum. Notice the ones that are tipping you into the high arousal state. Notice the ones that are tipping you into low arousal state. I might even share another post with a little bit more detail of what's on either end of those spectrums, so you know what you're looking for. But I believe if you start to really notice, take this conscious thread now and start to weave it and bring more awareness into each day between now and next Sunday, I'd really love to check in and see what you discover in a week from now about your own patterns. Until then, dear ones, wishing you a beautiful Sacred Sunday. May you have some deeply nourishing time with yourself today in whatever way serves you the most. And I look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Blessings.